Chapter 25. Into the City of the Ancients. The trail cut southward when the ridge became too steep to climb. It crossed the trough of the ravine and carved up the opposite hillside in sharp switchbacks. Beyond the ridge, the ground leveled out and soon led to another shallow ravine, where a second creek, this one much larger, cut a wide swath down the hillside. A small wooden bridge crossed the creek here, and beyond, the trail zigzagged up the hill on the other side. The trail opened up at the bridge, and the collected army of bandits and farmers paused at the clearing. Prue and Curtis made their way into the milling crowd around the bridge and the creek. Curtis dipped his hand into the babbling water of the creek bed and ladled the cold liquid into his mouth. Prue stood alongside, her hands at her hips. Brendan approached. "I noticed you travel unarmed, outsider," he said with a cocked eyebrow. "I respect a man or woman who fights with their bare hands, but you don't look the type." Prue frowned, saying, "I hadn't really given much thought to it, actually. I thought maybe I could be some kind of nonviolent support, if that's okay with you." "Very well," said Brendan. "You and Curtis come up to the front of the column. I may well be able to use you to carry orders down the marching line." When the soldiers had had their fill of creek water, Brendan gave a quick, shrill whistle, and the column fell back into position, weaving its way up the hillside just beyond the little bridge. Curtis and Prue jogged to the head of the line, Prue carefully pushing her bike by the handlebars, until they were just behind Brendan and Sterling the fox. How far till this place, what's it called?" asked Curtis after they reached the top of the ridge. Brendan monitored the column as it arrived above the switchbacks, motioning for the crowd to follow the crest of the ridge eastward. "Ancients Grove, just east of here. An hour's march, maybe less." Prue asked the next question. "What's the Ancients Grove?" "Site of a forgotten civilization," responded Sterling, falling in behind Prue and Curtis. "No one knows much about them, but it is believed that all of Wildwood was once a thriving metropolis full of philosophers, farmers, and artists. It's said that they perished centuries and centuries ago, a flourishing culture wiped out within the span of a few decades, victims of a ruthless barbarian invasion." Brendan, from ahead, grumbled, "I see where you're going with this, Fox." The fox ignored him. "The only remnants of this vast civilization, so advanced for its time, is this single grove of ruin that we are now marching on, and the descendants of the barbarian horde that extinguished it." "Who'd that be?" asked Curtis. "You're marching with them," said the fox. "These honorable bandits." "That is completely unproven," retorted Brendan. "And besides, maybe those ancients got what was coming to them." "Believe what you will, hoodlum," said the fox. "Believe what you will." There was a cracking in the surrounding vegetation that silenced the marchers, and the line ceased at Brendan's frantic wave of an arm. He relaxed, however, when he saw it was Septimus the rat, scurrying out from under a thicket of ivy. Arriving at Brendan's feet, he shivered. "Nyeh," he said. "That stuff gives me the creeps." "What's up, brat?" asked Brendan. "What have you seen?" Septimus shook his head. "Blackberries, blackberry brambles, far as the eye can see, just beyond that grove of alders there." He was winded from running and paused to catch his breath. "Impassable," he concluded. Sure enough, as the long column of farmers and bandits made their way through a peaceful stand of tall alders, their leaves a kaleidoscope of yellow and green hues, they arrived at an impressive snarl of blackberry bushes that stretched like a wall in either direction, seemingly impregnable. Brendan cursed under his breath. "Men," he hollered to the line, "we'll have to cut our way through." The army dove into the brambles headlong, their swords, scythes, and hacksaws a blinding flash of iron against the green of the bushes, but to no avail. The farther they were able to cut themselves into the dense thicket of briars, the more the bushes seemed to fall upon them, catching their uniforms and clothing in their sharp claw-like thorns. Brendan finally pulled away, returning to the grove of trees. He hiked the sleeves of his tunic up to his elbows, and his forearms were laced with red scratches. A few leaves clung to his beard.
Blast it all! I should have known this. It's been years since I've been to the grove. This must have seeded and grown in that time.
Iphigenia, said Prue, remembering Iris, the young acolyte, and the braided tuft of grass. We should get Iphigenia. Brendan looked at her askance.
What's she gonna do? Meditate them away?
Trust me, Prue said. Just let me go get Iphigenia. Brendan set his hands on his knees and briefly held his head down. Sweat was pouring from his brow and glistening against the strange tattoo on his forehead.
Okay, outsider, he said. But move quickly. We're running out of time.
Prue engaged the kickstand on her bike and set off down the trail at a swift sprint. The line of soldiers extended back to the switchbacks leading down to the creek bed, and they all stared as she whipped by them. She cut the last few switchbacks in 2 short leaps and bolted over the small bridge to arrive at the cluster of caravan wagons that were laboring their way up the narrow path. Iphigenia! She shouted, arriving at the first wagon. A small door behind the driver's seat opened, and the elder mystic's head peered out over the shoulder of the driver, a robed badger. What's the matter? She said. Why have we stopped? Prue paused to catch her breath from the sprint. They need you, at the top of the ridge. What's happened? Asked Iphigenia. Blackberry brambles, explained Prue. We can't go any farther. I thought you could, ask them to move. What is the meaning of this? Asked Iphigenia when she arrived at the top of the ridge. We are quickly running out of time. The sun is reaching its zenith.
Apologies, madam, said Brendan. We've hit a snag. The bramble of berries is impassable, and to make our way around it would waylay us for far too long. The girl has suggested you might be of some assistance in the matter.
Iphigenia harumphed and stamped her foot beneath her flaxen robe. She stomped forward to take in the wall of brambles. This bramble has been here for many, many years. Why did we not take a different path? Brendan reddened.
I was not aware the bushes were here, he said, attempting a gentle diplomacy with the aged woman. At least, not in this density. I would surely have chosen a different path, but this is the only one afforded to us now, considering the time.
Would you have your own camp, your bandit hideout, moved, torn apart, scattered at the insistence of, perhaps, the trees? Asked Iphigenia unsympathetically, her hand waving towards the canopy of branches above them.
I don't even know how to answer that question, responded Brendan.
Iphigenia glared at the king for a moment before capitulating. Very well, she said. I will ask the blackberries if they will move.
What?
He asked.
I'm not sure I heard you right. Did you say you were going to ask the brambles to move?
You heard right, Bandit King, was Iphigenia's response as she hiked up her robe and prepared to sit cross-legged on the forest floor. I can only ask. I make no promises. If they deny this request, there's little I can do. Blackberries tend to be rather stubborn. Brendan was speechless. He looked over at Sterling the fox and stared, searching for an explanation. Sterling lifted his shoulders in a shrug. Iphigenia, the dirty hem of her sackcloth robe gathered about her crossed ankles, sat on the ground and began to meditate. Curtis shot a questioning glance at Prue. Watch, said Prue quietly, confidently. A calm breeze fluttered through the alder grove, scattering the mosaic of fallen leaves around the bent knee of the mystic. A brief sunbreak cast rays of golden light through the alder boughs, and Prue squinted to feel the warmth of the sun against her cheek. Iphigenia breathed deeply and loudly, the rhythm of her breath proving an odd soundtrack to the late morning. Brendan, having suffered the quiet meditation session for a few minutes and borne witness to no results, made an angry curse below his breath and stalked off. A gap arose from the crowd of soldiers on the ridge. A gasp arose from the crowd of soldiers on the ridge. Suddenly, the blackberries had begun to move. They moved slowly at first. A few snags in the tangle of thorny vines separated, as if an unseen force was moving its way through the bramble, before picking up speed, and the bush disentangled itself from itself like the tentacles of some vast octopod. Where the vines were anchored to the ground by a rooted stalk, the capillary tendrils snaked to the ground, and the bush widened, opening like a great thistly flower. Before too long, the motion of this long horizon of brush came to a gentle stop, and a great thoroughfare had been laid through the deep grove of briars. Iphigenia's loud breathing softened and ceased. She opened her eyes, and, looking at the bramble, nodded a wordless thanks. She then stood up with some difficulty, tottered over to Prue, and grasped her elbow for support. Brendan, standing at the edge of the tree grove, blanched. "Now, Bandit King," said the elder mystic reproachfully, "if we can avoid such displacement in the future, I and the forest would greatly appreciate it." The army walked quietly through the grove, surrounded by the bone-white stone of the topped columns, this ancient city bearing silent witness to their every moment. Alexandra rode in the middle of the coyote host, the ocean of uniformed canine bodies spilling out into the clearing around her. The baby was asleep now, nestled against her chest, calmed into slumber by the gentle rocking of the horse's stride. The ivy made a deep bed of green, suffocating nearly every other living thing in the vicinity. Only the marble and stone runes that jutted from its clutches seemed to defy the plant's supremacy in the grove. Here was a wide slab of white, block-hewn stone, perhaps the foundation for a market square. There were the teetering remains of a columned archway, a central auditorium. On a squat ridge above the clearing stood the remnants of a long colonnade. "What a waste," thought Alexandra. "So much knowledge lost to the ages." A soldier disrupted her thought. He was a young coyote, barely older than a pup. His gold-ornamented uniform hung loosely at his shoulders. "The plinth, ma'am," he informed her. "Just ahead, above the little hill, in the ruined basilica." "Basilica? I've been instructed to tell you so." "Thank you, Private," said the governess, searching the horizon. "You've done well." Here they were. The moment was close at hand. The sun was approaching its highest point. Soon it would be the noon hour. She could sense the ivy seething below the horse's hooves, the dark green leaves and their little snaky fingers seeming to lick at her ankles. Patience, my darlings. Patience. The scout returned, breathless. "The grove," he finally spouted. "Just ahead. The coyotes have beaten us there, but just barely." Brendan received the news silently. The army of bandits, mystics, and farmers stood in wait. Behind them, the blackberry bramble had tangled itself back into its previous impassable shape when the last of the soldiers had made their way through. Now the entire army had amassed in the shade of a vast collection of ancient fir and cedar trees. Between two of the tallest and thickest trees of this glade lay the first evidence that this had once been a tamed country. A single fluted column, not unlike the ones Prue envisioned littering the landscapes of Rome and Athens, had toppled here, creating a bizarre contrast to the wilderness of its surroundings. It was in the shadow of one of the column's shattered sections that Brendan gathered his captains together. Cormac, Sterling the Fox, and Prue. "Why am I here?" was Prue's first question. "You'll be our messenger," explained Brendan. "Very important function." "Okay," said Prue leerily. She was a little uncomfortable with the designation. People's lives were at stake here. Brendan spoke quietly. "The plinth is in the center of the grove. Space is made up of 3 separate levels. Think 3 giant steps cut into the hillside. The governess's army will be watching, marching to the lowest. It was some sort of gathering square. The 3rd tier nearest us is the clearing where the plinth is.
We'll meet the Coyote army at the middle tier. That's where we'll have our fight. That way, if we get pushed back, we can still defend the plinth."
He looked each of the captains in the eye before continuing.
"We split into 3 units," he explained. 2 flanking units and a spearhead. Cormac, you'll carve northward. Sterling south. I'll lead the central unit from above, coming in from the west across the 3rd tier. You'll be positioned on either side of the middle tier, north and south. Move on my command. Hopefully, we'll be able to split their forces in half between the 1st and middle tier where the plinth is. In the end, though, we have one goal, and one goal only. Keep the governess from reaching the plinth."
He turned to Prue.
"We'll be split apart, and communication will be of utmost importance. This is where you come in, Prue. You'll need to relay information between the units. Is that clear?"
Prue nodded, desperately tamping down the fear that was beginning to rise from the depth of her belly. She wondered if her tennis shoes were up to the task. She wished she'd worn her cross trainers, the bright pink ones her parents had bought her for her birthday. She'd refused to wear them. They were so ugly. That consideration seemed quite petty now. Brendan heaved a momentous sigh.
"We've got about 600 fighters against their 1,000. This won't be pretty. But if we can just keep that plinth protected and stop the governess from completing the ritual, any lives lost will not be in vain."
The sun broke through its veil of clouds, and Brendan glared defiantly as it cast its light.
"Now,"
he said. With a sudden jump, he leapt to the top of the fallen piece of column and gave a low whistle to the awaiting crowd of soldiers.
"Men, women, animals, all,"
the army of farmers and bandits murmured as they gathered around the speaker.
"Once in these quiet groves, a great civilization thrived. A city of momentous proportion graced these grounds, full of life and thought. Today it is no more. But its ruins stand as a stark reminder to those of us who have survived whatever ravages befell it. A reminder that no one is safe from the machinations of those who, at any cost, wish to destroy the advances of brotherhood and civility."
He paused, surveying the crowd.
"Brothers and sisters," he continued, "humans and animals, today we forget whatever grievances we may have with one another in an effort to combat a greater evil, an evil that threatens to undo us all. Today we are not Wildwood bandits. Today we are not farmers of Northwood. Today we march together. Today we are all brothers and sisters. Today, let us together be the Wildwood Irregulars, 600 strong, and let the mighty wood strike fear into the hearts of anyone who dares stand in our way."
The crowd exploded into a cheer. Prue walked back to Curtis, who was waiting along with the rest of the soldiers for their orders. "What's happening?" he asked. "Why'd you get to go over there?" "I'm a messenger," she said. "I'm supposed to run communications between the units." "Ah," said Curtis knowingly. "Communication ops." Brendan, having jumped down from the fallen column, began disseminating orders to the gathered soldiers. He split the large crowd of soldiers into 3 sections. Curtis was placed in Sterling's unit. While the soldiers were receiving their marching orders, Curtis walked over to Prue. "So this might be it," he said dolefully, holding out his hand. Prue shook it. "Yep." The host around them began to take shape under the direction of their captains. What had been a single milling crowd became 3 taut blocks of eager soldiers, their ragtag display of weaponry brandished at the ready. The 2 outside blocks peeled away from the central one and began to make their way to either side of the grove ahead. Curtis watched his troop on the move and quickly turned back to Prue. "If I don't see you again," he said, "maybe you'll just let my parents know that I did this for a good reason. That at the very end, I was truly, truly happy. I mean, I really found some place where I felt I belonged. Will you tell them that?" Prue felt tears rising in her eyes. Curtis, she said, you can tell them that yourself. It's been nice knowing you, Prue McHugh. For reals. His eyes began to water, and he ran his uniform sleeve across his nose. Prue leaned over and kissed him on the cheek. His show of emotions made it easier, somehow, for her to forget her own fears. Likewise, Curtis, she said. He sniffed back a tear. Bye, Prue, he said, and jogged away to join his troop. Prue stood watching the column of soldiers disappear into the thick of the forest. When they'd gone, she turned and saw Iphigenia emerge from one of the caravan wagons and wave her over. Stay with me, dear, she said, until you are needed. Prue climbed aboard the carriage, sitting down next to the elder mystic on the driver's bench. She was attempting a half smile when the dam broke on her emotions and she began sobbing. Warm tears poured down her cheek. She could taste their saltiness on her lips. Iphigenia, surprised, began rubbing her back. There, she said consolingly. Why the tears? I don't know, babbled Prue through her sobs. This is just all so overwhelming. Just to get my brother back. I mean, me just being here. I feel like everyone I come in contact with, I'm ruining their lives. You needn't wear it all on your shoulders. Bigger events are in play, my dear, Iphigenia said. Far bigger than you. Your brother's disappearance was merely the catalyst to a long chain of events that has been waiting to tumble since the first seedling sprouted in this forest. You had as much control over your own involvement of these events as a leaf does of the time of its falling. We must only follow. We must only follow. Prue sniffed and carefully wiped a few tears from her cheek with the sleeve of her hoodie. But if I hadn't come here, or if my parents hadn't made their deal with Alexandra, and I was never born, we wouldn't be here. All these sweet people and animals wouldn't be putting their lives at risk. There is as much benefit to wishing the world away as there is to demanding a bud to bloom, responded Iphigenia as she patted Prue's hand gently. It is better to live presently. By living thus, perhaps we can understand the nature of this fragile coexistence we share with the world around us. Prue straightened in her seat and tried to gain control of her feelings. The mystic's words, while being comforting in their way, seemed to open up a greater mystery. Where will you be? She asked. I will stay behind, explained Iphigenia. My order decrees this. I will sit in meditation until the battle ceases. The victor will be clear, and the forest will inform me of this. If the governess prevails and the ivy is let loose, then I will simply become a part of the forest. To me, this is not a horrible fate. It is an inevitability. Prue squinted at the mystic, puzzling at the peaceful resignation on her face. If she were to spend more time with the old woman, she was going to have to get used to the mystic's startling frankness. In the wide glade, Brendan waited for the two flanking units to depart. He spent the time sizing up his troop, satisfied that enough time had passed. He jogged over to where Prue sat. It's time, he said. I need you by my side. Prue nodded and hopped down from the carriage, swallowing her remaining tears. She gave a final look to Iphigenia, smiling, before turning to walk towards the waiting soldiers. Something made the dowager governess pause as she slowly walked her horse through the ankle-deep banks of ivy that blanketed this ancient ruin. A thought, like a mild, warm breeze on a cold day that dissipates as soon as it arrives, fell over her. A suspicion, a hitch of unease. But why, she thought, in this moment of victory? It had been so easy. There had been no resistance. And yet she felt something deep in her bones, something whispered among the trees, perhaps, a quiet murmur from plant to plant. as if the forest itself was intending to rise up against her. She laughed the thought away. Even the Northwood's mystics in all their power could not bring the forest, this lawless cosmos of greenery, to their side. The baby was waking. She looked down at him and cooed. He smiled in response, wiping the sleep from his eyes with two balled fists. He blinked at the sun, bright, the sun that had nearly climbed to its highest point in the sky. That was when the forest broke open. Brendan was the first to give the command. "Center column," he began. Prue stood at his side as they looked over the embankment at the oncoming horde of coyote soldiers, the tall, implacable figure of the dowager governess astride her horse in the center of the multitude. In her arms was a swaddled baby. "My brother! My baby brother!" The thought blocked all others from Prue's mind. She fought the urge to scream his name. "Attack," Brendan finished levelly. The conjoined army of the bandits and the Northwood farmers, the Wildwood irregulars, broke through the line of trees above the ruined center of the ancient city, and the eerie silence of the ivy-strewn clearing was instantly shattered by their full-throated, impassioned voices. Prue saw Alexandra's horse rear in surprise, nearly bucking its rider from her saddle, and screamed. "Mac!" she cried, giving in to her instincts. Her heart surged with protectiveness for her baby brother. The spearhead, the center column of the Wildwood irregulars, led by the copper-haired bandit king, descended the hillside like a great wall of water being released from a dam, and crashed into the unsuspecting army of coyotes with a loud explosion of sounds. Bodies collided, iron clashed. Their battle cries, yelps, and howls erupted into the air and echoed off the marble stone of the ruined city. The coyote fusiliers had been caught off guard, their muskets unloaded, and they were forced to defend themselves by bayonet. Even the coyote swordsmen had to struggle with their sheathed swords in the chaos of this initial melee, gaining the irregulars an acute tactical advantage until the coyotes were able to wrest themselves free of combat long enough to draw their weapons. Alexandra wheeled her horse into the middle of the throng, and kicking his flank, shot past a pair of dueling soldiers to arrive at a safe distance on a stone platform. There, she took the baby in her hands and placed him, upright in a saddlebag. His pink face peered out from the top of the leather bag. Alexandra took hold of the reins with one hand and drew her long, silvery blade with the others. "Coyotes!" she hollered. "Attack!" A wave of coyote reinforcements crested the hill into the bowl of the clearing, smashing headlong into the crowd of warring soldiers with a loud crash. They'd come prepared, their sabers flashing amid the tight scrum. A long line of fusiliers appeared behind them and began packing their musket barrels with powder and ball. The irregulars, despite their early advantage, appeared to be losing ground. "Prue!" came a voice from below the ridge where she was positioned. It was Brendan. He'd run halfway up the hillside and was carefully engaged in a delicate sword fight with a particularly large coyote soldier. "Yes?" she called. "Get to Sterling's unit," he shouted over his shoulder between saber clashes. "Tell them to move in." "Got it," yelled Prue, and she leapt from her crouched position. The soldiers, huddled as they were in the deep green carpet of ivy, heard the telltale sounds of the battle cresting the ridge. Curtis winced at the shouting voices, the sound of clashing steel, and the crack of gunfire. His heart started racing in his chest. Sterling lay sidelong against the sloped ground, listening to the first salvos of war, his eyes flickering in anticipation. "Blast it all," he muttered. "Why don't we just attack?" The sound of footsteps in the underbrush eclipsed the distant noise of battle. "Prue!" shouted Curtis, seeing his friend approach at a sprint. She was crouching low as she ran, her clothes decorated with fallen leaves and strands of spider webs. Sterling jumped up to meet her. "What's the word?" he asked frantically, as she slid into the underbrush beside the gathering soldiers. "Go," she said, fighting for her breath. "Brendan says move in." A glow erupted in the fox's eye. "Finally," he said, and turned to the 200 men, women, and animals that lay hunkered down behind him and said, "Let's move." Prue and Curtis shared a quiet glance before the soldiers on the hillside, with a great collective holler, leapt up from their positions and stormed the crest of the ridge. "Good luck," Prue mouthed as Curtis was carried by the wave of soldiers over the ridge and into the battle below.